Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Barry Harker and you're listening to Life Learnings. My guest today is Dr. John Hammond. Last week, John told us about his professional life in retirement. Today, I'll be talking with John about growing up in Malaysia and his personal conversion and spirituality, amongst other things. John will also tell us a couple of his favourite stories. For those who missed the conversation last week, here's a brief profile of Dr. John. John retired in 2010 after 41 years of continuous service for the Seventh Adventist Church. He has been a teacher, school principal, college lecturer, college president and education director for the church at conference and union levels. He's also been a graduate supervisor at Massey University, where he completed a PhD in geography. From 2001 to 2010, John was the National Director, Adventist Schools Australia. John is married to Sue and they have 3 married children and 4 grandchildren. In 2006, John nearly died after breaking his neck and back and spent a long time in a coma and many months in hospital. John has also travelled extensively in remote Australia and his hobby is making quality knives. He's a much sought-after speaker and storyteller and is equally at home in front of an audience or alone in his workshop. Welcome, John.
Thank you, Barry. Lovely to be here.
Thanks for joining me again. I thoroughly enjoyed our conversation last time and I look forward to speaking with you again. John, tell me where you were born and where did you grow up?
I was born in Sydney at the Royal Hospitals for Women in Paddington. For a while there I thought I should have been born in a man's hospital, but I learnt better. But my first 4 years, our hometown was Kempsey in the mid-north coast of New South Wales.
Why Kempsey?
My dad had a practice there and was surgeon to a practice. And when I was 4, he got a call to go to Jamaica. And he turned it down because he had a new house, a new car, 3 small boys. And then he said to my mother a few months later, if they ever call again, I think we should go. And we got a call to go again to Jamaica, and just before leaving, the church asked us instead to go to Penang in Malaya, as it was then. And my father said yes, and then he said why. He should have asked it the other way around. And I said, well, the doctor has left quickly because there was a war going on. It became known as the Communist Terrorist Emergency or the Emergency. And every European head on the island was worth $5,000 attached or otherwise. And so Dad took a gulp and he said, is there anything else? And they said, well, actually, we have a bit of a plague with snakes at present. Poisonous ones, well, they're cobras, which are aggressive and poisonous. And so with those cheerful words, we flew by Constellation and got to Singapore and up to Penang on the 4th of October, 1949.
Now, we have a promise from you that you're going to tell us a story.
Yeah.
And I think this is probably an appropriate place for you to tell the first story.
Well, we arrived at our house at 22 Brown Road on the outskirts of the town or city, and the hospital was about 1 kilometre away. And I know the experience of being a brand new missionary, and my parents would have had the same feeling. All was strange. We arrived at night time, jungle noises, oppressive heat, and we slept after a fashion. Being a small boy, I slept like a log. And early in the morning, my father opened the back door to get a breath of fresh air, barefoot, and he put his foot onto the back of a 13-foot hamadryad or a king cobra. And he felt this thing writhe and wriggle, and he slammed the door so fast, he nearly left his foot outside. And that's one of my early memories of Penang, was Dad's hand shaking and his voice quavering, informing my mother not to unpack anything, that we were returning to Australia tomorrow on the first flight. And with that, we sat down and had breakfast. And he was probably reflecting on the return missionary stories he'd be able to tell after being a missionary for 18 hours. And anyone who knew my father knew that he never really lacked indecision. And he thought hard during breakfast, and he said to my mother, I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll have prayer, and then I'm going to open my Bible, and I'm just going to open it anywhere and shove my thumb in, and if there is not a message from God under my thumb, then we'll go home. Simple as that. And so we did. It was a good prayer. And knowing that whatever was going to be under his thumb would significantly alter their lives for the rest of their lives, he opened his Bible, and under his thumb was a text he'd never read before. That was Luke 10, verse 19, and I notice you're looking at me as I say this. I don't need to look it up because it became our family's favourite text. This is what it said. He'd never read it before. Behold, I give unto you power to tread on serpents and scorpions, and over all the power of the enemy, and nothing shall by any means hurt you. And he looked at my mother and he said, I think we have to stay. Well, we were there for 12 years, and in that 12 years, we killed 12 cobras in the bathroom alone, not the rest of the house. I mean, one came under the dining room table while we were having Sunday lunch. Dad was in the middle of an operation at the hospital, and we cleared off and rang the hospital. He left the patient in an anaesthetic state for an anaesthetised state for 10 minutes, came home, got rid of the snake, went back and finished it. We were never bitten. Mind you, we got chased. But we were never bitten. I still don't put on shoes until I click the heels together in case there's a scorpion inside. We were never stung. But the second part of the text, and over the power of the enemy, all the Europeans on the island, or most of them, had 1940 model Fords with half-ton of armour plate and just a little hole in the windscreen. But the terrorists would chop a tree down in front on a jungle track and then chop a tree down behind, and without air conditioning you had to get out. And they would just shoot you. And one of their favourite tricks was to sneak into the town and knock on a door in the middle of the night, and when you open the door, just shoot you dead. And one night at about 2 o'clock we got that knock. And Dad went to the door. He stood behind a pillar and he asked in English, who is it? And in Malay and Chinese and Tamil. And finally a voice said, Doctor, we have a sick man. And every doctor who's taken the Hippocratic Oath will go and do their best. And he opened that door wondering whether it was his last moment here on earth. And there were two men there. And he said, where's the sick man? Oh, in the car on the road. Now, that to Dad was one of the longest walks in his life. It was only a few metres, but he believed he was walking into a trap. But he went out, and on the back seat was a man nigh unto death, and he had a ruptured appendix. And he said, why didn't you take him to the government hospital? They sent us away. He said, quickly go to our hospital and we'll be there. And he followed in his car. Operated, saved the man's life, kept him in hospital for 3 weeks. He'd never heard of Christ, but he gave him Chinese copies of Signs of the Times, and never charged him anything. And the man went home, and we heard nothing more about it until the day before we left the country. 12 years later, there was a knock on the door, and Dad had already left. He was in Australia. And there was a Chinese man at the door. It was quite safe. The emergency was over. And he asked if he could speak to Dr. Hammond. And I said, oh, he's back in Australia. He asked if he could speak to my mother. So I said, La Chapeng, come in. He asked if she could remember this incident of the sick man, and she couldn't. And he said, do you know who that man was? And even now the name's man is sensitive, but any person, any Malaysian would know that this man was in charge of all the communist terrorists, and a fearsome man. And it was him. And then he held out a piece of paper just about A5. There was our photo of our car and its number, P5104, and the 5 of us. And there was a message in Chinese and Malay. And it said that this family is not to be touched, not to be harmed in any way. And this was a message distributed to every communist terrorist camp from Johor in the south to the Siamese border. And so it was just the day before we left, God opened the window of heaven just a fraction to let us peek in and see how we had been protected. One of the big regrets in my life, being a collector of eclectic bits and pieces, was I didn't keep that piece of paper. And it was signed by order. This is my personal protection. And so on the strength of that, we lived in Malaya for 12 years.
That story's pretty hard to beat, John.
It's true.
Yeah, it's an amazing story. Tell me about other members of your family. I've got a profile of your dad already.
He was an orthopaedic surgeon. He brought the current technology, or was current in the 1960s, in hip replacement surgery. He worked with Sir John Charnley at the Centre for Hip Surgery in England. Sir John wanted Dad to succeed him, but he wanted to come back to Australia. He became the original hippie doctor, and he replaced over 4,000 hips prior to his death. And I have a brother who's also Dr. Brian Thomas Hammond, but he's a radiologist. That's caused a few confusions. I must admit that there's too many doctors in the family, because my son is also a doctor. He's up in Queensland. But Dad always believed that his 12 years in the mission field as a general surgeon gave him wonderful experience. In fact, when he did his fellowship of the Royal College of Surgeons in England, he flew through, and I think he was one of 3 out of about 400 who passed on their first attempt.
What about your mum?
My mother was Scottish, came out when she was 12, never lost her accent, and she was a Howie. Anyone who knows the Howies knows that they're all lateral thinkers. And she was the perfect foil for my father, who was a brilliant linear thinker. He didn't have terribly much perception about people, but my mother was an absolute lateral thinker and knew people, and people suggested I might be a combination of the two. I hope it's a good combination.
Tell me about your brothers.
Brian's a radiologist.
Is he the older? Or?
He's my older. Mum had 3 boys in 3 years. And so my younger brother, Gordon, who was an Adventist minister for 17 years, and he's worked in psychology and photography since then. There's only 10 months between us, so I have a twin brother for 2 months of the year. I don't come much closer than that.
What was the impact of being number 2 in these 3 boys? I
think, well, there was no literature written on childbirth order in those days, but looking back, if I want to view my life with a degree of self-pity, then I could say I was a classic case. I also accept the fact that I must have been a difficult kid at times. A middle child survives in different ways. And I'm sure there are many middle children listening at this moment saying, I can identify with that. But we had a very cosmopolitan upbringing, went to many schools in different countries. And I just look at the whole thing as a preparation for what God wanted. I'm always conscious of the fact that God probably picked me out many generations before I was born. I mean, the Bible tells us that even under the 10th generation, he's looking and he's knowing.
What was it like growing up in an Islamic culture?
We had to be very careful. The Islamics that we grew up with were very gentle people. And I've always had no problem visiting and dwelling amongst, because I say to them, our Sabbath follows right after yours. And so we're all getting in the mood about the same time, and our holy day starts on Friday evening. And I'd love to come and eat at your place because we don't eat unclean food. And that warms them up. But there is also a belief among thinking Muslim theologians that the Seventh-day Adventist belief structure is more accepting and tolerant of Muslim beliefs and more in tune to what they are trying to do. There are many, many good Muslims.
How long were you in Malaysia? I think you said 12 years.
Yeah, 12 years.
And from what age were you? You were about 4?
4 to 16.
4 to 16, yeah. You've told me about your experience at school previously, and you've also told us about your school experience with Mr. Boyle. Would you like to tell us a little bit more about your personal conversion?
When, from the age of about 8 or 9, I was always thinking about baptism. I enjoyed going to church, and there was something about being part of a church community that always appealed to me. When I was going through the difficult teenage years, my parents were wise enough to let me fully participate in the local youth scene at the church. And so I went to Pathfinders, and I'd go to the pastor's house. And I had a wonderful Chinese pastor who retired and is buried here in Kurrambong, Pastor Chong Tat Kong, and his wife and family. And a child giving their life to God can only see God through the eyes of their own perception of human beings who represent God. And so I was surrounded by youth leaders and a pastor and a church community that were totally accepting of me, and there was no question in my mind. But by the time I was baptised, particularly after this experience with Jimmy Boyle, I was ready to be baptised. And strangely, I was baptised knowing that I would not be perfect. I don't think I was baptised into some euphoric, although I did let God badly down on the day of my baptism. I was riding to church and I had a brand new white shirt, and a man going past in the bus decided to get rid of his load of well-chewed beetle juice that had been in his mouth for an hour or so, and he spat it out the window. I left a blot on my back about the size of a dinner plate, and I think I pursued him in inappropriate language, about 3 different languages, and the whole bus rocked with with laughter. So I had a test on the day that I was baptised, but we survived that.
Now, tell me about your wife.
I'd be nothing without my wife.
What's she like?
Sue. Sue was born in Traralgon in Victoria, but grew up on a pineapple farm at first and on a dairy farm. Her father was a cripple, and mother and 3 girls ran the most efficiently run dairy farm in the district. There wasn't a weed. If they ever wanted to go to the beach, they had to spend the day lopping weeds before they went. It was a hard life, and there was not much about cows that Sue doesn't know, and she has said that she'd be quite happy if she never saw another one in her life. But she has supported me with coming up to 46 years of marriage. I met her here at college. And as soon as I saw her, I thought, I'm going to change your surname to Hammond. She laughed at my silly jokes, so that was a good start from my point of view. But she's a very quiet person, and she's not upfront, but she's very, very faithful and extremely loyal. Extremely good principal's wife. You could never catch Sue gossiping or telling tales. She comes from an Irish background. Her ancestors were carefully selected by the best judges in Ireland, and she's got that Irish temperament, so you don't walk on her. But she's a wonderful grandmother to her children, and I just couldn't imagine life without her.
What are her interests?
She loves working in the garden, and she loves looking after her children, and she spends an hour every day, and she's transcribing the Bible. And she takes notes, and she has a little desk in a quiet corner of the house. And I think that is probably her most precious time of the day.
Tell me about your Christianity and your teaching. Give us a little bit more detail about the relationship that you see between the two of them, particularly in relationship to your own life.
I found teaching extremely fulfilling. I couldn't have imagined doing anything else. I've always felt a calling to preach and to teach, but to start a day with a bunch of school children, whether they are kindergarten or early high school or senior high school, and talk to them eye to eye about their issues and what's good for them, and to see the look in their eye of enjoying learning. You can see it going in, and that they want to contribute to. Barry, is there a better job in the whole world? I actually got paid for doing this.
I think if you're doing something that you really love, it's really great. And I think in terms of your professional life, it's important to love what you're doing, because that motivation is important in terms of enriching every aspect of what you do, your understanding of it. As you know, I've spent a number of years as a teacher and an educational administrator myself. And the thing that I think I've taken away from that experience is that you will never get a child to learn if you place them under pressure, make them anxious and stress them. So there's got to be a good relationship between the teacher. The student has to know and understand that someone appreciates them, has mutual respect. You demand mutual respect, but at the same time, the fact that they know that you love them and are looking after their best interest draws out the very best in them, I think.
Yeah, well, they know that you love them. And if you don't, I have seen teachers spend a lifetime in the classroom, I think, to exact revenge, and they're hated for it. But if you love the children, you love their company, and you love telling stories, and you love imparting knowledge, and you have a good dose of incipient immaturity, then you've got a wonderful career ahead of you.
Yeah. I think also the same applies to teachers who are under your care. I think you have to take the same attitude to your teaching staff as you do to your students. There's got to be mutual respect, but they've also got to know that you have their best interest at heart. And I believe that schools run from the top, that a principal is there to establish the climate in which everyone can do their best, both teachers and students.
Yes, a principal has a principal role, there's no doubt about it. You get a good principal and put them in a district where there's no students, they'll soon attract students. Probably the hardest role that I've had is being principal of boarding schools. So I spent 8 years doing that. That is really hard work, because you have students coming from homes that are sent there because their own school system and their parents and family have given up on them, and this is the last resort, and they really are hoping that you'll turn them around. Sometimes you do and sometimes you don't, but I have seen some wonderful turnarounds.
I think that for me is one of the most satisfying aspects of the teaching profession, to see the influence that you have on a young life that could go left or right, and to help people to make the right choices. And one of the things I really appreciate about modern education is the emphasis on choice and cause and effect, and helping people to understand the consequences of their choices so they make better choices for themselves.
I've always got to remind myself, when I'm talking to a bunch of 10-year-olds, another 10 years they'll be calling you by your first name, and they'll be your equal. And they'll remember how you treated them. They'll remember your attitude towards them. They'll remember whether you like them or loathe them. A lot of people forget this. These little kids are going to grow up, and they're going to grow up quickly. And I'm now bumping into grandchildren of the kids that I taught.
Yeah, that must be satisfying.
It's wonderful.
I wanted to ask you about your time in Fiji. You were principal of Fulton College there in the 1980s. Tell me what it was like in the Fijian culture at that time.
It was. It's good to bring up your own children in a different culture for a while. So for my family, it was good. And we had students from 19 different countries, and culturally, getting them all to mix you had to work at it very hard. You couldn't just say we're going to have a sports day and Samoa versus Fiji versus Tonga versus Kiribati. I did it once in my inexperience, and it wasn't a near riot. It was a riot, and they were going to punch each other's lights out. And I said, I'll never do that again. So you handle them very cautiously. You lean very heavily on your cultural group leaders to advise you. And I had to train them because they're used to the boss being the final word, and for them to come and advise you, they feel it's disrespectful. So I had to try and teach them, if you see a problem coming, I'll be even more grateful if you come to me and have a chat. And they wouldn't come. So I would set aside a period each week where I would talk with the Tongan leader, I would talk with the leader from Kiribati or from Tahiti, or from Pitcairn. We had students from all over, and you just asked them what's happening, are there any problems, and I found that was very, very useful in keeping peace and calm on the college. But yeah, we loved our time there. We could see that they were building up to a coup, and which did happen just after we left. There was an inevitability there.
Tell me about the challenges of moving around on your family.
A lot of things that we valued in life have been lost and broken over the years. I think we moved house about 19 or 20 times. We made sure we came in from the mission field when our children were starting high school. I didn't want them to go through what we had gone through in adjusting again to another culture. So we moved from Fiji to New Zealand. We were there for 7 years. And so they transitioned, and each time they were into senior high school, we were there long enough for them to have every opportunity to get a good university grade.
Tell me about your children and how things have worked out for them.
Very well. Greg, our oldest, after I had my mishaps with neck and back, he decided to do medicine because of certain things that he had witnessed in his own life as well as mine. But he'd been involved in a major accident where he'd kept his best friend alive long enough for the flying doctor to arrive. Greg, being like his father, was doing some bush exploring with a four-wheel drive and come across a head-on accident, and that really affected him. He joined SES and then later ambulance, and then did the GAMSAT exam and did medicine, and now he's got his letters in obstetrics and gynecology. So he's done very well. He's got two little girls. Claire, our older daughter, did midwifery and did it very well. She loved it, and she's married and lives in Goulburn. And Felicity, our youngest daughter, is married, and Brad's a policeman, and they live in Kurrumbong, and she is a very good photographer. So she specialises in baby photography, so I advertise for her, calling her the baby whisperer.
The baby whisperer. How did you combine your career, obviously a very busy one, with your family life? Did you take any special actions to ensure that you kept a balance between the two?
I tried to keep in mind what my father had done. He was extremely busy doing a number of fellowships. He ended up with 5 of them and was extremely busy. But he made sure that when he spent time with us as children, it was really good quality time. You get some parents who can be with their children all the time, but a lot of it's not quality time. And so in the early days, it was hard. I was going to university 4 nights a week, and we had 3 small children. I can remember going in one night, and Greg, who was about 6, bawling his eyes out as I backed the car out the driveway to go off to uni. He wanted to play with me, and I got halfway to university, and I did the hugest, loudest handbrake U-turn, and went back home. I didn't go to uni for 2 weeks, and I just played with him. But when I got to doing my PhD, when I was putting in 15-hour days, the children were at the stage of having to study hard for senior high school, And they always felt that I was setting a good example for them and we'd all be studying together. And they discovered how useful their father was when it came to correcting essays and giving advice on how to get good marks. And so that really helped things along. But it was a normal family, and we found ways around making sure that our family time, the biggest blessing was the Sabbath. And the university staff just were amazed that I would knock off on Friday afternoon because I had my own office, and you wouldn't see me till Sunday morning. And they said, how, when you're under so much pressure, can you just forget about it? And I actually had them coming around to my house and knocking on the door on a Sabbath afternoon just to make sure that I was doing what I said I would. And they'd find me on the floor listening to music, or we'd be out walking or going up in the Ruahine Mountains in New Zealand. And having the Sabbath, that was a time that you would spend with the family, and there'd be nothing to interfere with that. Every family in the world needs to have a Sabbath day.
We'll go to a break now. When we come back, I'll be talking with Dr. John about his perspectives on life and the challenges of being a Christian in a post-Christian society.
If you have any questions or comments in relation to today's program, you can call 3ABN Australia Radio within Australia on 02 4973 3456, or from outside of Australia on country code 612 4973 3456. Our email address is radio@3abnaustralia.org.au. That is radio at the number 3 ABN Australia, all one word, .org.au. Our postal address is 3ABN Australia Inc., PO Box 752, Morisset, New South Wales 2264 Australia. Thank you for your prayers and financial support.
If you've just joined us, I'm Dr. Barry Harker and you're listening to Life Learnings. My guest is Dr. John Hammond. We've been talking about John's early life. In the last part of this second program, I want to explore the wisdom that John has gleaned from his life as a Christian educator. But before we begin, I'm going to ask John to tell us his story. Now, this is a Bible story. We've explained before that John researches thoroughly stories from the Bible and then he tells the story. So he's going to tell us one of his stories right now. Thanks, John.
Thanks, Barry. I want to tell a story about a girl who was born into a prosperous home. Small village, best part of town, happy family, and as she grew, obviously was a very pretty girl. And you know what it's like in a church. You see young people growing up and you just start to see them blossom. And one day they had a new pastor, and he stood up and he noticed her too, but he must have been more interested in her body than her soul, because he befriended her. And eventually he became intimate with her and took something from her and started her on a track that was a very sorry one. When a child has been sexually abused, often they start to demonstrate very promiscuous behaviour, and it wasn't long before this little girl had a bit of a reputation around the church. And can you get worse than that? In a small town, in a small church? Well, it did. She became known in the village as being an easy person to get. She, let's put it literally, became the town prostitute. And you shake your head and think, this beautiful child, can she do anything worse than that? Well, she did. Somehow she became involved in spiritualism. I've grown up in the tropics. I've lived in Pacific Islands, and I know that a person's life can become totally degraded when you get that combination of sexuality and evil spirits. And finally she was in a complete mess, and she was a complete outcast. She left home. She went as far as she could go in the same country and still speak the same language. But Jesus met her, and he identified the problem immediately and simply threw out the devil. And one version of the Bible says that Mary Magdalene had 7 devils cast out. Another gospel writer says it was the same devil 7 times, but boy, was she grateful. and she idolized Christ. She wanted to get close to him, but the disciples had a ring of safety around her. They weren't going to let him get anywhere near her. And but often, when a person is on the periphery of a conversation, they can hear things that the others don't. And the disciples heard Jesus say, well, I'm going to set up a new kingdom. She heard him say, I'm going to die. The disciples heard him say, you will be the generals of my new kingdom. She heard him say, you're all going to clear off and leave me. And she realized that he was going to die. So she thought, if I can't get near him in life, I'll prepare for his death. Now, there was a party going on because the man who had caused the problem, he must have had a guilty conscience and become sick because he got leprosy and no one would touch him, but Christ healed him, and that was Simon the Pharisee. And we are told that he was the same person that first seduced Mary Magdalene. And when he was healed, he wanted to have a party. They were all invited, but not Mary. But with your imagination, you've got to remember that every village had an apothecary where they sold perfumes because they believed that a person's spirit would try to return for 4 days. And so they would keep the body sweet with perfume. And she goes to the apothecary and she asks for the very best perfume. And he probably showed her all the in-between stuff. And she looks him straight in the eye as only an ex-prostitute could. And she says, I want the very best, no mucking about. So he goes to the safe and he opens it up and he's not even going to let go of it. He said, well, there it is. That's $40,000 worth, a year's wages. She says, I'll take it. Well, he's a good Jewish shopkeeper. He knows how she's earned the money, but he takes it. And she goes off and she's probably saying to herself, you fool, Mary. You're impulsive as ever. What have you done this for? And she takes it home. But the scenario is set because at the party, she's not invited. She's looking through the window. She sees that nobody has washed Jesus' feet. So she goes home and gets this perfume. And this perfume has come from the Himalayas, from the spikenard. And to show you how valuable it is and how special it is, in 1922, when Howard Carter discovered the tomb of Tutankhamun, he dug down 16 steps into blank earth, but he uncovered the steps and he came across a door that hadn't been opened for 32 centuries. Now, Barry, you try and imagine 3,200 years. There is a door and the seal is on it. Nobody has opened it in 32 centuries. He got into it. Oh, I'd love to have been there. And he goes through the various rooms until he comes to the burial chamber. And there was a pot, and inside the pot is a little jar. And if you go to the Cairo Museum, look for the little leopard with the pink tongue. It had spikenard in it from the roots of a little plant that grows up near the snow line in the Himalayas. And in his account, he says when he took the lid off, that perfume was still flowing out after 32 centuries. And there was this incredibly valuable thing in an alabaster jar that was never to be broken. The impulsive Mary Magdalene brings along and she breaks it open and smears it on his feet. And as the smell goes across the room, the conversation dies and they're all looking at her. You know who the first person to speak was? It was Judas. His keen nose, he smelled expensive perfume and he says, oh, that money could have been used to feed the poor. This was the same man who was milking the common purse for his own needs. And the rest of the disciples who thought that Judas was pretty good, they were murmuring, saying, yeah, this is good. And here was Mary utterly embarrassed. The last thing she wanted was to be singled out for attention again, and the whole crowd is looking at her. And Jesus, he speaks up and he says, leave her alone. And he uses a word that's only used once. He said, she has done a kalos thing. The Bible says beautiful. You know, we try and define that word and redefine it and redefine it. When you and I were young, we used to say, oh, beauty. You know what kids say today? Well, wicked, I think, is one of the things. That means nice. And they're still trying to redefine that word. She's done a beautiful thing. You know, he was to die a few days later. And at that moment, Mary was the only person alive who fully understood his mission. It was Mary who followed him to the cross. It was Mary who stood at the cross. Mary was there when he was buried. And of all people ever born, just get this, just take a moment to savor it. Isn't it amazing that Christ chose a reformed prostitute to be the first person to reveal the risen Saviour? And he said something about it, because while we have been talking and while our listeners have been listening, we have fulfilled a prophecy from the Bible. And I'm reading it here. In Mark chapter 14 and verse 9, "Verily I say unto you, wherever the gospel shall be preached throughout the whole world, this also that she hath done shall be spoken of for a memorial of her." And to me, that is my favourite story from the Bible, because Jesus chooses people not because what they were, he chooses them for what they will do for him. And it amazes me that Christ chooses people. He could get an angel just sitting here and interviewing you. Boy, it would do something for your ratings. But he chooses simple, sinful human beings, because when a human being can reflect the face of Jesus Christ to the world, it is a terrible rebuke to the devil. It is doing everything the devil said was not possible, that a human being can be Christ-like. That's what our salvation is all about.
Imagine what the world would be like, John, if everyone looked at what we could be rather than what we are. In other words, if we saw the potential in the individual that Jesus saw in Mary Magdalene, and we extrapolated that to our behaviour in the world, what a marvellous place it would be if we were all looking out for the interests of other people.
Well, this is the problem with the world, and the countless books you read on the power of positive thinking and how to be a success in life. It all dwells on the power within you. But Christ comes completely around the other way, approaches it from reverse and saying, I'm not worried about your past. I'm not worried about your education. I've had my eye on you since before you were born. And I'm only interested in what you can do in my name. And it is very hard to be a negative personality. In fact, it's impossible when you keep that thought in the front of your mind.
John, tell me about the person in your life who has influenced you the most.
My mother and father were very, very powerful. I've had some very good mentors in life, and God has put some wonderful people across my path. And I would pay tribute to some of our older ministers and education directors, many of whom have passed on, who just played a wonderful role at the right time. You know, when I first graduated, our senior pastor in the district was Pastor Eric Boehm and his wife, Grace. They just took us and they were like parents to us. There was none of this, now this, and don't do that. And mind you, he had to tell me once or twice that I was acting a little bit too much like a youth. And then people like Pastor J.B. Keith and Aubrey Mitchell and people like Dr. Gerald Clifford, who died last year, who was our education director, and lecturers at college who were very kind. A Dean of Men, Don Bain, who took me aside and very gently pointed out that just hang in, you'll graduate soon. And these sort of encounters mean a lot to me because they come from the lips and minds of people that I've always respected, and I would take it from them. And there was nothing harsh. Although I did get one or two very harsh ones, but they were also given in love. And I think one of the best tellings off I got was from a farm supervisor in Fulton when I pick some of his crop of cassava for visitors who suddenly arrived without clearing it with him first. He was infuriated with me, but out of that came a very, very strong friendship because we both had to bend a little bit. And I've had some wonderful mentors in life, some of them people that you wouldn't even imagine, people that God sends along at the right moment to just to give you that support.
John, this leads in, I think, to the whole question of transmission of Christianity from one culture to another. Obviously, these older mentors that you had a powerful influence on your life. We live in a post-Christian culture now. The Christian foundations of our society are not there in the way that they might have been 50 or 60 years ago. What are the great challenges that you see for Christian education in trying to make that transition from one generation to the next? And are we actually accomplishing that?
To your last question, yes, but it's something you have to work at. It's 46 years since I started teaching, and the increase in knowledge and the changes in society follow a logarithmic curve. Its knowledge is increasing at a frightening rate. And the way we approach knowledge is incredible. I mean, if my computer breaks down, my 6-year-old grandson will be standing near me and say, "Oh, press that button, Grandpa, get the thing going again." But we live, as you said, in a post-Christian society that is glibly explained, and then you can go on. But teachers in our school are having to combat the theories of evolution, and it goes even deeper than that. That there is no God. So the first thing you have to establish that the world was created by a God who loves us. What I have discovered, that there was a period after the church went through a crisis in the early 1980s where our sermons no longer spoke of the soon return of Jesus Christ, and they became very dry, psychological expositions. And all of a sudden I discovered that our students in school were craving to be told about final day events. You can tell them there's no God. You can tell them things are going to go on for a long time, but they want to know. I believe that in every human being, this might sound like a well-worn cliche, but there is a God-shaped vacuum. There is something innate to every human being that believes in a higher power. I had a debate at university where I got launched into it against my choice. It was just announced that I was going to debate as to whether God exists or not. And I was warned that the lecturer, and a professor, was going to absolutely demolish my logic. And I said, he said, "Oh, she hates God." And I said, "Well, that's a good start, because if she hates God, she at least knows he's alive." And he said, "Don't be too smart. Your day is coming." And I was petrified. I had 3 weeks to prepare. And on the great day, the lecture theatre was full. I was a postgraduate student by this time, and I had my speech all ready. And this woman didn't turn up. We waited and waited, and the professor made a few phone calls as to where she was. And then he came back ashen-faced, and he said, "Oh, she took her own life this morning." And he said to me, "You've got all the time." So I said that God is not a person who can be put under a microscope and analysed. But I said he is there, and I told the story of the text in Luke where God gave us a promise that he'd protect us from the enemy and from serpents. And I told my own personal experience. But you know what argument was the one that was the most convincing? I asked the students there, and there was a couple of hundred, if they believe that there are forces more powerful than us around us, extraterrestrial forces, forces for evil. And they said yes. And I said, "Well, I'm glad you said that, because it's obvious that there are forces that we cannot really control." And I said, "Isn't it logical that these forces might be in battle with each other, that there might be," here we go, coin a phrase, "a great controversy"? and there's a force between good and evil. Isn't it logical? I said, I'm not asking you to believe it, but isn't there a logic to this? And that there is a God who did create us. And I said, forget that then for a minute that he created us. I said, that might be sticking in your craw. But I said, just to try and imagine a supreme being who loves us, who's always been there. And I said, I cannot say this without saying I believe we are created because he loves us. But he's there. And he is trying to shield us. And finally, this will result in a confrontation between good and evil where the world will never be the same again. And I said, you've only got to look at the way the world is changing. This is in the 1980s, and before we'd got into the situation we're in today. And they left a very somber group. And in the end, there was no one wanting to argue it. And so we deal with students who live in this world with tremendous pressure. And, I mean, when you and I were young, if a couple lived together without being married, it would be the talk of the town. These days, it's the talk of the town if you decide to get married and then have relations. And the children in our schools are living in this environment. Their access through the media, they can access anything instantly. There was a stage until 20 years ago where if a young person wanted to know something, they had to go to an older person to get that knowledge. Knowledge is power. Today, they get the knowledge before we have it, far more advanced than what we have. And with that knowledge, they are setting attitudes. And so when you are talking, and I talk with student groups the whole time, they will listen to a story if it is the story of salvation, and they will believe you if they see that your life reflects what you are trying to tell them. And that is how God can reach them, because he then moves in on their conscience. They have to make a decision. But making a decision these days is far more complex than it was in the days when everybody believed God and everybody believed in a judgment. We live in a world that is totally confused.
How do we get the attention of students? How do we get the attention of this generation who's obviously facing the sorts of challenges to faith that probably no other generations had to face, at least for a long, long time?
I tell them my story. That's all I can do. At the same time, it behoves me to be knowledgeable as possible about the issues that they face. If I'm totally ignorant of their trends, there's certain things I cheerfully admit to. I say to you, sorry guys, but your music just sails over the top of my head. But I said, I can explain to you why you listen to your music, which is postmodern, and I will then challenge you to explain to me what postmodernism is, and I can explain to you how it works and how you are part of the postmodern or the post-postmodern experience, and you don't even know you are. And that intrigues them, and so they are then prepared to talk to you if you can talk to them openly but informed. And that is the challenge for reaching young people these days. You've got to be informed.
So it sounds like explaining to people the dynamics of their lives is probably a useful place to start? Helping to understand the influences and forces on them?
As long as they don't suspect, there is a sermon coming up.
Yes, I'm sure.
And I said previously that if you sermonize, you'll start to lose them. But if you let them pick up the points of the sermon, they'll come to the same conclusion.
John, we're running out of time. Tell me something that you know about life, from your experience of life, your knowledge of the Bible, that you think we all ought to know.
For a start, one thing that I absolutely love, and it's part of my study, is that Christ is the centre of every book in the Bible. He is featured from Genesis through to Revelation, and I love the messianic prophecies, and I love to go through and to link the stories in the Old Testament to the life of Christ. The book is 66 books written by a bunch of different authors with different views, and that's what makes the Bible so wonderful to me. It doesn't worry me if there are occasional contradictions. That indicates to me that they're all different people, and God accepts them. I met a man on a plane flying into Los Angeles, and he was sitting 2 seats away studying his Bible all night, and I happened to be next to him in the line waiting to go through immigration. And I said, I noticed you reading your Bible during the night. And he said, I noticed you reading yours too. And it soon came out that I was a Seventh-day Adventist. Then he asked me a wonderful question. He said, why are Adventists different? And I was waiting for the question because I said, I'm a Seventh-day Adventist because Jesus Christ was. Well, that just about stopped him in his tracks. And I said, seventh day, Christ worshipped on the Sabbath day. He never once said, abandon the Sabbath day. And his father said, remember the Sabbath day. That lasts forever. I said he was an Adventist. Because he is the Advent, and the state of the dead, he died, and he knew nothing. And I went through this. In fact, when we finally got to the immigration counter, the man called me over and he said, I've been watching you. You've been having a Bible study with that man for 40 minutes as you went up and down. Oh, I said, you were supposed to be doing your work. Oh, I said, I'm trained to look for the unusual. And he asked me, what were you on about? And I said, I was telling him why I'm a Seventh-day Adventist, because Jesus was. He closed his counter. We talked for another 20 minutes, stamped all my paper. He said, anyone that comes in to talk about Jesus Christ is welcome, and welcome to the United States. And he called a lackey from over the other side. He said, you take this man, pick up his luggage, and escort him out into Los Angeles. And to me, being a Seventh-day Adventist Christian is just the most logical thing in the world. The Bible, when we get to the kingdom of heaven, we will be astounded, shocked, and ashamed to see how lightly we've treated it from time to time.
You mentioned a favourite passage for the family was the one in Luke. Do you have a personal favourite that's different from that?
I do, and that is in 3 John 4. I have no greater joy than to hear that my children walk in truth. That is my favourite text.
John, it's been really great talking with you today. As our custom is, I'm going to ask you now if you'd like to offer a prayer as we close this conversation today and the series of the series of 2 conversations, with a prayer and with a focus on, again, those people who may have had the sorts of experiences that you've had, and you know what they feel like and the sorts of things they've had to go through in their lives, but with a special prayer for them as we close our conversation.
Let's pray. Dear Father, we have had a wonderful time talking, and I have had the cathartic experience of telling about my life's journey. And there are many people listening who have not had that privilege. Dear Father, I just pray that each person listening will have the opportunity to express their love for you. May you just grasp that you are part of God's salvation. He has chosen you since before you were born. You have gone through life's experiences so he can use you. And I just pray a special blessing at this very second. May you feel that peace that passes understanding, that you are secure in the knowledge that Christ has paid the price for you. You have been redeemed, and he wishes to use you. I pray this in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. My guest today has been Dr. John Hammond. Remember to tune in again next time as I speak with another fascinating guest on Life Learnings. Bye for now, and God bless you and keep you.
You've been listening to a production of 3ABN Australia Radio.